Annie was a college sophomore who had basically become a permanent fixture at the local bookstore and coffee shop. Ever since a certain incident went down, she started coming here every single day just to kill time and avoid her problems. Internally, she felt like a total illegal resident of the fiction section, but at least the vibes were consistent. The shop was owned by a woman named Miss Key, who was practically a celebrity at Annie's school. Everyone obsessed over her, and Annie finally saw why when she spotted the owner sitting across the room. Miss Key was busy, sipping tea and looking like she belonged on a high-end magazine cover. The student body claimed she was pleasing to the eye, which was a massive understatement. As Annie tried to focus on her book, Miss Key suddenly looked up and caught her staring. Instead of looking away, the owner flashed a calm, knowing smile. Annie immediately bolted her eyes back down to her lap, her face turning a bright shade of red. She tried to play it cool, scoffing to herself that the woman wasn't even that attractive. Internally, she was screaming because she knew she'd just been caught in 4K. The day dragged on as the light shifted. The sky eventually turned pitch black outside. By 9 o'clock, Annie realized she was the last one left and needed to head home before she got locked in. She noticed Miss Key was also packing up to close the shop for the night. Annie walked out the door, her stomach growling loud enough to alert the neighbors. She started debating if the local BBQ spot was still serving, already picturing the plate of meat she was about to demolish. Suddenly, a hand landed on her shoulder, making her jump out of her skin. Miss Key was standing right there, casually calling out Annie's name like they were old pals. Annie whipped her head around, totally blindsided by the sudden confrontation. She demanded to know what the owner was doing, but Miss Key just leaned in way past the social distancing limit. She asked if Annie was cold, wearing a smile that was definitely a major death flag for Annie's heart rate. Annie stood there frozen, her brain short-circuiting from the proximity. Internally, she was throwing a fit, wondering why this woman was getting so close when they barely even knew each other. Miss Key didn't seem to care about the awkwardness, leaving Annie completely trapped in a very confusing, very pretty personal space invasion. Miss Key remained dangerously close to Annie right outside the bookstore entrance. She reached out and placed her hands on Annie's shoulders, effectively trapping the student in place. Annie's eyes went wide as she felt the older woman's gaze burning into her. Her face was already flushed a bright pink from the sudden proximity. Internally, she was panicking because this was way too much intimacy for a Tuesday. Finally, she couldn't take it anymore and shouted for Miss Key to wait. She demanded to know what the older woman was doing to her again. Miss Key just looked at her with a perfectly calm expression. She claimed she was just helping Annie fix her messy outfit. Annie wasn't buying the innocent act for even a second. She crossed her arms and let out an annoyed huff. Internally, she groaned at how easily she was being played by this lady's charms. Miss Key didn't let the attitude stop her and casually invited Annie to grab dinner. Annie shut her down instantly with a very loud rejection. She was ready to bolt for the nearest exit and never look back. But then she couldn't resist taking a tiny peek at the bookstore owner. Miss Key was standing there looking absolutely radiant with a playful smile. Annie felt her heart skip a beat and her face get even hotter. She let out another frustrated sound, realizing she was losing the battle of wills. Miss Key looked at the flustered student and decided she was a total cutie. Without any warning, Miss Key reached down and snatched Annie's hand. She held on tight, making sure Annie couldn't just run away into the night. Annie was completely blindsided by the sudden physical contact. Miss Key simply said it was time to go and started walking. Annie was being dragged along the sidewalk while she sputtered in total confusion. She kept shouting for Miss Key to stop and actually listen to her for once. Miss Key just kept her eyes forward and continued smiling like nothing was wrong. Annie was losing her mind at the blatant disregard for her protests. Annie looked at their joined hands and felt like her brain was melting. This was definitely not how she expected her evening to go. She was basically a hostage to a very pretty bookstore owner now. Internally, she raged, wondering if Miss Key came with a factory-installed voice-blocking feature. She really wanted to know if the woman was just deaf or if she was the world champion of ignoring people. Despite all her complaining, Annie didn't actually pull her hand away. She just kept yapping as they headed toward their destination. Miss Key seemed perfectly content to lead her wherever she wanted. It was clear Annie was no match for this woman's relentless pacing. One way or another, she was getting that dinner. Annie was actually feeling extremely moved by the whole situation. She couldn't help but think back to when they first met, which was easily the lowest point of her life. Back then, her reputation was absolute trash thanks to some seriously nasty school rumors. People were constantly whispering behind her back about her supposed secret life. They claimed she was doing modeling work outside of school, or that she was involved with multiple guys at the same time. Her classmates were total savages who didn't care about the truth. They called her every name in the book and accused her of being a boyfriend stealer. One girl even screamed for someone to just punch her already. Annie looked like she had been through a literal war zone, covered in bruises and looking completely exhausted. Internally, she had basically given up on finding anyone decent in the world. One day, while she was wandering around in her hoodie looking like a total ghost, she felt someone watching her. She turned her head and spotted a woman standing in the doorway of a place called Coffee Bookstore. It was Miss Key, and she was looking directly at Annie's battered face. Miss Key realized immediately that the girl was wounded and didn't look away in disgust. Instead of ignoring the drama, Miss Key simply gestured for Annie to come inside. Annie was totally blindsided by the random act of kindness from a complete stranger. She ended up following the woman inside for no particular reason, probably because she was too tired to resist. Once she was inside the shop, Annie sat at a table and looked around the quiet space. She noted to herself that the store actually seemed quite popular despite the calm atmosphere. Miss Kai approached her and carefully put down a steaming cup on the table. Annie sat there for a moment, looking suspicious and feeling like an illegal resident in a fancy palace. She finally gave in and took a long sip of the hot drink. Right as she was swallowing, Miss Key leaned in close and asked her if it was sweet. Annie practically had a heart attack and nearly spit her drink all over the table. Internally, she was screaming, "Look in the mirror if you want to see someone who's totally kidding me right now." Miss Key didn't even flinch at the reaction and told her to have some more. She then dropped a line that was straight out of a romance novel. She told Annie that if her heart felt bitter, she really should eat more sugar. Annie stared at her, completely stunned by the sudden emotional depth of the bookstore owner. She went back to drinking the tea, but her face was now glowing a bright, embarrassing shade of red. She tried to maintain her tough girl persona by shouting that her feelings were none of Miss Key's business. Even though she was acting like a total brat, it was clear that the bitterness in her heart was finally starting to melt away. She kept chugging the sweet drink while trying to hide how much she actually appreciated the gesture. It was the first time in a long time that someone had actually cared about the girl behind the rumors. Annie realized then that Miss Key was the first person to see her as something other than a target. This tiny moment of kindness was exactly what had started their weird, complicated journey together. One day, a persistent classmate cornered Annie under the trees and asked her to be his girlfriend. Annie didn't waste a single second before hitting him with a blunt rejection. Internally, she was already exhausted by the sheer audacity. Does this guy really think he's the main character of a romance novel? The guy didn't take the hint at all and claimed it didn't matter because he would be waiting for her anyway. After that, Annie's life turned into a low-budget thriller as the guy started showing up everywhere. He popped up at the library just to give her a creepy greeting while she was trying to focus. He followed her across the sports ground, trailing behind her like a lost puppy with zero sense of boundaries. He even invaded her personal space in the classroom, sitting nearby and acting like they were best friends. Internally, Annie was reaching her limit. Is there an app to block people in real life, or am I just stuck with this glitch? Eventually, the guy cornered her right outside the bookstore and claimed their meeting was a total coincidence. He then had the nerve to ask her if they could grab dinner together. Annie responded with a massive, soul-shattering eye roll because she was completely over his nonsense. She tried to walk away, but he kept calling her name like a broken record that refused to stop playing. In her head, Annie desperately wished Miss Key would appear out of thin air to rescue her from this social nightmare. Suddenly, a familiar voice called out her name, causing her to stop dead in her tracks. She spun around with her eyes wide, hoping her imagination wasn't playing tricks on her. There stood Miss Key, looking perfectly composed as she completely ignored the annoying classmate. Miss Key casually asked Annie if she wanted to go have dinner together instead. Annie's face lit up like a neon sign, her frustration vanishing in an instant. Internally, she was doing a full-blown victory lap. Finally, a dinner invite that doesn't make me want to fake my own death. She felt an immediate surge of confidence, thinking they were the ultimate power duo with the best coordination in the world. The classmate stood there looking totally blindsided, finally noticing that Miss Key had even gotten a fresh haircut. Miss Key gave a small smile and asked if the plan worked for her. Annie shouted a massive yes, with the biggest, most genuine grin she had flashed in ages. Internally, she scoffed at the guy one last time. Sorry, buddy, but you just got replaced by a literal legend. The dinner date finally kicked off, and Annie was absolutely demolishing her meal. She sat across from Miss Key with a literal tower of empty plates stacked next to her, proving that being rescued from a stalker really works up an appetite. Miss Key just watched her eat in silence, probably wondering how such a small girl was fitting all that food into her system. Internally, Annie was probably thinking, hey, don't judge, trauma requires calories. Miss Key let out a soft laugh at the sight, finding the whole situation more charming than weird. However, their post-dinner glow was cut short when the sky decided to dump a massive amount of rain on the city. They scrambled to find a taxi, and Miss Key played the part of the perfect protector, insisting that Annie get into the car first. Once they were both settled in the back seat, the rain started coming down even harder, turning the streets into a total mess. The driver immediately started groaning about how the traffic was becoming absolute garbage. He told them flat out that they were going to be stuck there for a while because the roads were basically underwater at this point. Annie stared out the window, feeling the awkward tension of being trapped in a small space with her crush. She eventually turned her head and realized that Miss Key had been staring at her the entire time. Annie immediately panicked, her face turning a bright shade of red as she looked down at her lap. Internally, she was screaming, "Oh my god, how long has she been watching me like a hawk?" She tried to play it cool, but her heart was doing backflips. She couldn't help herself and took a sneaky peek back at Miss Key. In her head, Annie started simping hard, noticing how Miss Key's skin looked incredibly fair and how her eyes were basically a cheat code for being beautiful. She got caught up in the details, mesmerized by how long Miss Key's eyelashes were. When Miss Key flashed a gentle smile, Annie's brain officially short-circuited. She needed to say something, anything, to break the silence before she literally melted into the leather seat. In a moment of pure social failure, Annie blurted out that Miss Key's eyelashes were really long. Miss Key just stared back at her in total silence, probably wondering if Annie had finally lost her mind. The air in the taxi became incredibly heavy as Miss Key just sat up straight and looked away. Annie started trembling, covering her mouth in absolute horror at her own lack of game. Internally, she was spiraling, thinking, why am I like this? Someone please eject me from this vehicle, right now. Her face was totally flushed as she realized she had just reached peak levels of embarrassment in front of the one person she wanted to impress. The taxi finally pulled up to the gate of a fancy residential community. Annie tried to play it cool, telling Miss Key she would give her a call once she made it back to the school dorms. Internally, she was praying the ground would swallow her whole so she could escape the awkwardness of her earlier eyelash comment. But the universe had other plans for our girl. Miss Key just sat there in a heavy, soul-piercing silence that made the air in the car feel like lead. Annie eventually cracked under the pressure and asked what was wrong. Without missing a beat, Miss Key told her they were both getting off right here. Annie was totally blindsided and had no clue what was happening. She jokingly asked if Miss Key was feeling lonely and wanted some company for the night. Honestly, she was just trying to break the tension, but Miss Key actually looked amused for once. She pointed out that Annie was a soaking wet mess and probably would not even have access to hot water at the dorms this late at night. Miss Key then dropped the ultimate bombshell. Since her place was close to the school anyway, Annie should just stay over for the night and head back in the morning. Annie stood there like a statue, her brain completely short-circuiting. To seal the deal, Miss Key gave her a soft smile and mentioned that she lived alone anyway. Internally, Annie was doing backflips and screaming. This was definitely not on her bingo card for the evening, but she was not about to say no to a sleepover with her crush. They headed inside the dark apartment, and the lights flickered on to reveal a sleek, modern living space. Miss Key immediately took charge and told Annie to go hit the bathroom first. She even bragged a little, mentioning she cleaned the bathtub every single day. Annie agreed, trying to act like being in a beautiful woman's house after a rainstorm was a totally normal Tuesday. She grabbed some slippers and shuffled into the bathroom, which looked more like a high-end spa than a normal apartment. Annie did not waste any time getting out of those damp, uncomfortable clothes. She peeled off her hoodie and prepared for the soak of a lifetime. She turned on the tap and watched the water fill the tub, feeling the steam start to clear her head. Stepping into the hot water felt like heaven, and for a second, all her social anxiety just melted away. She was finally starting to relax and enjoy the vibe. Suddenly, a sharp knock on the door nearly gave her a heart attack. Annie froze mid-soak, looking like a deer in headlights as her heart hammered against her ribs. Miss Key called out through the door, casually mentioning that she had brought over some fresh pajamas. Annie sat there in stunned silence, unable to even find her voice. Internally, she was losing her absolute mind. She actually thought Miss Key was about to pull a total power move and barge right into the bathroom while she was vulnerable. It was a total heart-stopping moment that left her completely rattled. Annie finally emerged from the bathroom, rocking the ruffled pink pajamas Miss Key had lent her. Internally, she was cringing at how much she looked like a giant strawberry, but at least she wasn't a shivering mess anymore. Miss Key was already waiting for her, looking as composed as ever. She handed Annie a steaming mug and told her to drink up to stay warm. Annie took the cup with shaky hands, her brain still trying to process the fact that she was actually having a sleepover with the bookstore owner. They sat together on the couch in a silence so heavy you could cut it with a knife. Internally, Annie was screaming because every time their eyes met, she felt like she was about to short-circuit. Miss Key broke the ice by asking if she had class the next morning. Annie managed to squeak out a yes while clutching her drink like a lifeline. Miss Key told her to finish up and head to bed, mentioning that she'd already tidied up the guest room. Internally, Annie was relieved but also weirdly disappointed that the interaction was ending so soon. Miss Key gave her a mysterious, gentle smile that had death flags for Annie's heart written all over it. She picked up the empty mugs and told Annie to get some rest. Annie hid her blushing face behind a towel, stammering out a good night. She was totally blindsided by how effortlessly cool Miss Key was being. After retreating to the guest room, Annie finally collapsed into bed. The clock on the wall ticked away as she eventually drifted into a restless sleep. She hadn't been out for long when she felt a hand reach out and gently stroke her hair. Internally, Annie went into a full-blown panic. She was screaming in her head, wondering if she was dreaming or if Miss Key had actually walked into her room in the middle of the night. The touch moved from her hair to her face, and Annie's internal monologue was basically just a siren going off. When a finger grazed her lips, she felt like she was losing her mind. Internally, she was shouting, "Are you in your right mind? Don't touch me there!" Annie jolted awake, sweating buckets and looking like she'd just survived a jump scare in a horror movie. She sat up fast, her heart hammering against her ribs. She realized she wasn't alone because Miss Key was sitting right there on the edge of her bed. The room was dim, but Miss Key's golden eyes were locked onto hers with an intensity that made Annie's breath hitch. Miss Key just calmly whispered her name, leaving Annie completely frozen and wondering if she was still stuck in a dream. Miss Key stood over the bed and whispered Annie's name, breaking the heavy silence of the guest room. Annie stared up at her, completely frozen and wondering if she was caught in a fever dream. Miss Key didn't seem bothered by the awkwardness at all and casually pointed out that Annie moves around way too much in her sleep. Internally, Annie was screaming. She wondered how long the woman had been standing there watching her toss and turn like a rotisserie chicken. Annie could only manage a confused noise, feeling totally blindsided by the lack of boundaries. Miss Kai explained that she noticed the door was open and just wanted to be a good host, but then she saw Annie had kicked off all her blankets. She told Annie she'd catch a cold if she wasn't careful and called her kitty. Annie's internal monologue was an absolute mess. She thought, I only kicked the covers because I was sweating buckets, lady. Please stay in your lane. She was totally confused by the nickname and looked at Miss Key with a blank stare. She demanded to know what was up with the cat talk and why she was being called a pet. Miss Key just gave a playful look and explained that Kitty was the name of one of her little nieces. Annie scoffed and pulled the covers up to her nose, declaring she was definitely not a niece. Internally, she was thinking, is this her way of flirting or is she just a total weirdo? Miss Key didn't back down, laughing and saying her niece has the exact same habit of kicking the blankets away. Annie had finally reached her limit and turned her back to the woman in a huff. She snapped that she didn't want to talk anymore and wanted to be left alone. She huddled into a ball, feeling like she was stuck in a very confusing and high-stakes sleepover. Miss Key stood there for a moment, just watching the girl sulk under the sheets. She had a look on her face that was way too smug for someone who just broke into a guest's room at midnight. She looked down at Annie with an enigmatic expression that screamed trouble. Finally, she whispered a good night and reached for the door handle. She gripped the metal and slipped out, leaving Annie in the dark. The door shut with a heavy bang that echoed through the silent house. Annie lay in the dark, her eyes wide as she tried to process the last few minutes. She clutched the sheets to her chest, her heart hammering against her ribs. She told herself to just drop it and go back to sleep because she had class in the morning. But as she stared at the ceiling, her memory started to clear up from the fever. Suddenly, she realized something was seriously off about the touch she felt earlier. She bolted up in bed as the realization hit her like a freight train. Internally, she panicked, realizing this lady didn't just tuck her in like a concerned auntie. She remembered the feeling of a hand on her head and the distinct sensation of fingers on her lips. She realized Miss Key had been way more hands-on than a simple blanket adjustment required. Outside the door, Miss Key was practically glowing in the hallway. She started laughing to herself, clearly enjoying the fact that she just played Annie like a fiddle. She looked completely satisfied with her late-night prowling. Annie was left shivering in bed, wondering what kind of house she'd actually agreed to stay in. Annie woke up feeling like a total zombie after her bizarre night at the bookstore. She let out a massive yawn, probably wondering if she had actually escaped that weirdly intimate situation or if it was all a fever dream. Miss Key was already up and acting like the perfect hostess, greeting her with a smile that was way too bright for someone who'd been playing mind games just hours ago. She invited Annie to sit down for a quick breakfast before she had to head out. Annie mindlessly chewed on some toast while Miss Kay played the role of a concerned big sister, asking if she was going to be late for her classes. Internally, Annie was just trying to keep it together while her brain screamed for more caffeine. After a quick goodbye at the crosswalk, Annie headed toward campus while Miss Key watched her go with that same unsettlingly calm expression. Annie was so exhausted she could barely keep her eyes open, feeling like an illegal resident in her own body. She eventually dragged herself into her history lecture, but the professor's monologue about ancient emperors and political affairs was basically a lullaby. The lecture hall was filled with students who looked just as checked out as she was. Annie didn't even try to fight it and face planted onto her desk, falling into a deep sleep right in the middle of class. She started dreaming about her childhood and her parents, proving her subconscious was definitely trying to retreat to a safer time. Later that afternoon, she staggered back toward her place, still yawning like her jaw was about to unhinge. She finally made it to her room and collapsed onto the bed, thinking she could finally get some real rest without any predatory bookstore owners hovering over her. She slept straight through the evening, the clock ticking away until it hit 10 at night. When she finally blinked her eyes open, her stomach was growling loud enough to wake the neighbors. She realized she was absolutely famished and needed to grab some food immediately if she didn't want to pass out again. She headed back out into the night, her feet somehow leading her right back toward the coffee bookstore. She noticed the lights were still on and realized Miss Key was still inside working the late shift. Instead of walking away like a normal person, Annie decided to take a little peek through the glass. She saw Miss Key sitting on the sofa, quietly focused on a book. Suddenly, Annie's heart started doing a frantic drum solo in her chest. Internally, she was totally blindsided. She couldn't help but think that Miss Key looked incredibly pretty in the soft light, which was a major red flag for her emotional stability. Miss Key noticed the shadow at the window and looked up, catching Annie in the act of staring. She gave a small, knowing smile and tucked a strand of white hair behind her ear, calling out Annie's name. The sheer, cool older woman energy was hitting Annie like a freight train. Annie stood there frozen, her face turning a bright shade of tomato red while her heart continued to pound against her ribs. She clutched her chest, wondering why she was reacting like a protagonist in a cheesy romance novel. Internally, she panicked, asking herself why her heart wouldn't just stop racing and let her live in peace. This was definitely not the vibe she was going for, but her body was clearly betraying her. Miss Key sat there looking entirely too composed and asked Annie what she was doing there so late. Annie completely fumbled the bag and blurted out that Miss Key looked beautiful. She immediately regretted her life choices and stood there looking like a total deer in headlights. Miss Key didn't even bat an eye and simply said thank you. Internally, Annie was losing it and labeled her a total narcissist for accepting the compliment so easily. Miss Key decided she was done sitting and finally stood up to confront her. Her heels clicked against the floor as she walked toward the flustered college student. She got right in Annie's personal space and asked again why she was lurking around at such a late hour. Annie went on a mental rant about how Miss Key wasn't even that pretty and was a huge narcissist. She tried to deflect the awkwardness by asking why the store was still open past closing time. Miss Key just gave her a subtle, knowing smile that definitely meant trouble. She leaned in and claimed the store was open because Annie hadn't showed up yet. Annie's face turned into a literal tomato as she screamed, asking what on earth Miss Key was talking about. Miss Key let out a small laugh and admitted she was just kidding. She reached out and explained that Annie had actually dropped her ID card at her place. Since she was leaving for her hometown for a week starting tomorrow, she needed to return it now. Miss Key handed over the card and mentioned she didn't have Annie's contact info, so she'd been waiting there the whole time. Annie took the card while feeling like a complete idiot for her over-the-top reaction. She watched Miss Key, realizing the older woman was always so at ease while she was a chaotic mess. Miss Key was funny and composed, which only made Annie feel more like a penniless amateur. As Annie stood there brooding over her own awkwardness, Miss Key called out her name to snap her out of it. Miss Key let out a heavy sigh and asked why she really came out so late. She reminded Annie that the dorm gates were about to close soon and she'd be locked out. Annie panicked and lied through her teeth, saying she had just woken up and was looking for something to eat. Miss Key looked her over with a concerned gaze and asked if she hadn't slept well the night before. She reached out and cupped Annie's face, asking if she felt uncomfortable or sick. Annie's heart was doing backflips as she weakly denied feeling any physical pain. Miss Key's eyes narrowed slightly as she looked at her with an unreadable, intense expression. She explained that she'd been killing time with a book while waiting and totally forgot to eat. Since they were both supposedly starving, she suggested they go grab some food together. Annie stood there stunned for a second, totally blindsided by the invitation. She eventually managed a quiet sure and followed along. Internally, she realized she was in way over her head. Annie concluded that Miss Key was a very sly woman who knew exactly what she was doing. On day one, Annie was busy at a photo shoot, trying her best to look like a professional model instead of a chaotic college student. She stood under the bright studio lights while the photographer snapped away, capturing her looking surprisingly composed. Once the flash stopped, she reached down and picked up a bottle of water to rehydrate from the heat. The photographer approached her and announced they were officially done for the day. He told her she did a great job and mentioned they would send over the edited photos shortly for her to promote. Internally, Annie was already mentally checking out. She figured she'd post them, but her mind was clearly somewhere else. With Miss Key out of town for a week, Annie found herself feeling totally aimless and bored. She realized she had absolutely nothing to do, so she decided to head over to the coffee bookstore anyway. Even though the owner was gone, the shop felt like the only place she belonged. She arrived at the entrance and stared at the sign, feeling a weird sense of emptiness. By day 2, she was back at her usual table, sitting perfectly still like a piece of the decor. She looked completely lost in thought, staring at nothing in particular. On day 3, the isolation really started to get to her. She sat in the same spot, looking absolutely miserable as she leaned against the table. She stared at a single flower in a cylindrical vase and let out a heavy, dramatic sigh. Internally, she was hitting a wall of frustration. She wondered why she was even there when the person she actually wanted to see was miles away. She looked totally drained, thinking about how the entire world felt boring without Miss Key's sly presence. By day 4, Annie stood outside the glass doors of the bookstore, but she couldn't bring herself to go inside this time. She told herself to just forget it and turned away, feeling like she was bordering on stalker behavior. A few days passed in a blur until the calendar hit day 8. Annie was walking through the building when she spotted 2 students chatting near the window. She overheard one of them excitedly mentioning that Miss Key was finally back from her trip. Annie froze in her tracks, her eyes widening as the news hit her like a ton of bricks. Instead of feeling relieved, she immediately spiraled into a pit of annoyance. She couldn't believe that Miss Key was back in town and hadn't even bothered to send her a single text. Internally, she was throwing a full-blown tantrum. She felt totally ghosted and wondered if she was just some random kid to the older woman. She found herself drawn back to the bookstore, pressing her hand against the cool glass of the window. She stared through the pane, wondering if Miss Key had any idea how much she had been struggling. Suddenly, a realization hit her that made her heart skip a beat. She realized she actually missed her, and the thought was terrifying. She tried to backtrack immediately, questioning why she would ever miss someone who manipulated her so easily. She turned around and started to walk away, trying to regain some of her pride. But as she moved, her eyes started to sting and her vision went blurry. Tears began streaming down her cheeks, and she couldn't do a single thing to stop them. She stood there in the middle of the walkway, completely blindsided by the weight of her own feelings. Internally, she was reaching a level of peak humiliation. She sobbed into her hand, wondering why she was crying over a woman who probably hadn't thought about her once. She felt like a total mess, realizing that her heart was officially compromised and there was no going back now. Annie spent her entire lecture face planted on her desk like a total loser. Internally, she was panicking because she was way too terrified to face Miss Key after her recent emotional meltdown. Every time the woman's face popped into her head, her heart did a painful somersault. She felt like a total amateur for letting a bookstore owner get under her skin this much. The bell finally rang, and the professor ended the torture by assigning homework to the class president and dismissing everyone. Annie stood up, staring into space like a glitching NPC. She debated with herself for a solid minute about whether she should go to the bookstore today. She quickly shot that idea down, deciding she was better off hiding in her room forever. Just as she was about to make a break for it, a very expensive-looking shoe blocked her path. She looked up and found herself face-to-face with the woman of her nightmares and dreams. Miss Key looked as calm as ever, which was honestly kind of annoying. She explained she was just there to visit a professor from the XXX department. Annie could barely process the words and just stood there like a deer in headlights. Internally, she felt like Miss Key was miles away, even though they were standing right next to each other. She managed a weak response, feeling totally pathetic for being so awkward. Suddenly, Miss Key reached out and cupped Annie's face with her hand. She asked if Annie was feeling sick, and the physical contact sent Annie into a total system override. Her face turned into a bright red tomato as she wondered why on earth this woman was invading her personal space so casually. Internally, she was screaming for help, even though she was technically a grown college student. Miss Key didn't seem to notice the internal crisis and mentioned she'd bought a ton of new books during her trip. She invited Annie to a staff dinner later that night, and just like that, Annie's anxiety vanished. She did a total 180 and agreed to go with zero hesitation. Miss Key gave a little cough and promised to text over the address for their 7 o'clock meeting. Annie was riding a massive high as she showed up at the restaurant later that evening. She pushed through the doors and spotted Miss Key sitting at a massive round table with a bunch of random staff members. Miss Key waved her over like they were best friends, which was definitely news to Annie's nervous system. Annie walked over and took her seat, feeling like a total outsider among the employees. She sat down next to Miss Key, feeling the heat from the woman's presence. She didn't know anyone else at the table and felt like a complete third wheel. She kept her head down, staring at the floor like it held the secrets to the universe. Miss Key wasn't having any of that and asked if the ground was really that interesting. She reached over and lifted Annie's chin, forcing her to look up. Annie's brain screamed in a panic, begging Miss Key to stop being so touchy-feely. Internally, she was shouting that they definitely weren't at the chin-lifting stage of their relationship yet. She wished she had a manual for how to handle these mixed signals. Miss Key just smiled, completely oblivious to the fact that Annie was currently dying inside. The rest of the staff just watched, making the whole situation 10 times more embarrassing. Annie wondered if she should just make a run for the exit and never look back. She couldn't believe how easily Miss Key could play with her emotions like a pro gamer. This dinner was definitely going to be a long night of dodging death flags and trying not to pass out from blushing. Miss Key continued talking about her trip while still keeping her hand near Annie. Annie tried to focus on the conversation, but her heart was beating way too fast. She felt totally blindsided by this sudden invitation after a week of silence. Internally, she wondered if Miss Key even realized how much stress she had caused her lately. Probably not, since the woman looked as cool as a cucumber. Annie took a deep breath and tried to act like a normal human being for once. She realized that despite the awkwardness, she was genuinely happy to be there. Her mood had swung from depressed to ecstatic in record time. She promised herself she wouldn't make things weird, but that was easier said than done. Miss Key finally let go of her chin and started ordering food for the group. Annie felt a strange mix of relief and disappointment when the contact stopped. She knew she was in deep, and there was no turning back now. The staff dinner was in full swing, and the employees were basically lining up to peer pressure Miss Key into another round. Annie sat there like a frustrated third wheel, watching the drinks pile up while the staff kept chanting for more. Internally, Annie was losing her mind at the lack of professional boundaries. She couldn't believe Miss Key was just letting them fill her glass over and over without a second thought. She scoffed to herself, wondering why the bookstore owner was so easily swayed by a few drinks. Miss Key was definitely starting to feel the effects. Admitting to herself that she was getting more than just a little tipsy, Annie decided to play the responsible adult and shoved a plate of food toward her. She told Miss Key to eat something immediately because she'd clearly reached her limit for the night. Miss Key didn't reach for the chopsticks, though. Instead, she slowly turned her head and stared at Annie with a look that was way too intense for a crowded restaurant. Annie started to sweat, wondering why she was being targeted by that heavy, drunken gaze. She felt like a deer in headlights as Miss Key continued to eye her up. Suddenly, Miss Key reached out and grabbed a lock of Annie's hair, pulling her in surprisingly close. Annie's heart started doing backflips in her chest. She panicked internally, screaming about how her heart was about to explode while Miss Key just stared into her soul. Miss Key's eyes were completely glazed over and flushed red as she leaned in even further. The distance between them vanished, until they were practically sharing the same oxygen. Miss Key just kept whispering Annie's name over and over like a broken record. Annie was totally overwhelmed by the proximity, noticing that Miss Key's breath smelled like a dangerous mix of alcohol and something sweet. She realized she was in a serious romantic death flag zone and finally found the strength to push her back. Annie hissed at her to sit down and behave, terrified that the other employees were catching the whole show. She told Miss Key to get it together because people were definitely staring at their little moment. Miss Key didn't even blink, casually leaning on her hand and claiming she wasn't drunk at all. She also pointed out that absolutely no one was actually looking at them. Annie turned around to check, and sure enough, the staff were busy laughing and eating like nothing was happening. They were totally ignoring the high-stakes drama unfolding right next to them. Annie was completely baffled by the situation. She wondered what kind of brainwashing Miss Key had done to these people to make them so unbothered. Internally, she was screaming, asking herself why the employees were turning a blind eye to their boss's wild behavior. She felt like she was the only one living in reality while everyone else was on a different planet. The staff continued their meal as if their boss wasn't currently hitting on a college student in broad daylight. Annie just sat there, totally blindsided by the weirdly chill atmosphere of the bookstore crew. She couldn't tell if they were being respectful or if this was just a Tuesday for them. Regardless, her heart wouldn't stop racing from the near-miss encounter. She decided that from now on, she was the designated sober person for life. Miss Key just gave her a smug, sleepy look that made Annie want to disappear. It was clear that the night was far from over and the chaos was just getting started. The staff dinner finally wrapped up, and the coworkers started waving their goodbyes as they headed for the exit. Annie found herself stuck with a very tipsy Miss Key while everyone else disappeared into the night. Since her boss was basically a walking safety hazard at this point, Annie decided she had to be the responsible one. She told Miss Key that she would take her home to make sure she didn't end up in a ditch. Miss Key immediately pulled the classic drunk person move, insisting she wasn't drunk at all while staring blankly into space. Internally, Annie scoffed at the denial. Since her boss was clearly 3 sheets to the wind, she watched Miss Key wobble away and couldn't help but think that the cold CEO was actually pretty adorable when she was wasted. As they wandered through the streets toward the XSX community, Miss Key suddenly came to a dead stop. Annie was totally blindsided by the sudden halt and asked what was wrong. Miss Key didn't answer right away and just stood there in silence near the fence. She slowly looked up at the sky and then looked back down at the ground as if she was contemplating the meaning of life. Then she turned to Annie with a serious expression and dropped a total bombshell. She straight up asked Annie if she could hold her right then and there. Annie's brain basically short-circuited on the spot. She blurted out a shocked response, wondering if the alcohol had finally reached Miss Key's brainstem. Miss Key just leaned back and claimed she was so drunk she couldn't even stand up straight anymore. Before Annie could even process the request, Miss Key took a clumsy step and conveniently tripped over a tiny rock on the pavement. She lost her balance and went stumbling forward with her arms outstretched. Annie's reflexes kicked in, and she shouted her boss's name in a panic. She managed to catch Miss Key just in time, preventing a total faceplant on the hard ground. Internally, Annie breathed a massive sigh of relief, thinking that was a dangerously close call for her boss's expensive face. However, while Annie was worried about safety, Miss Key was secretly celebrating her successful landing. She huddled into Annie's chest, thinking to herself that this was actually a great turn of events. Annie held her tight and asked if she was okay, but Miss Key wasn't planning on letting go of this golden opportunity. She suddenly pulled Annie even closer, wrapping her arms around her and holding on tight. Annie's heart started doing backflips as she realized just how close their faces were. Miss Key leaned in and whispered Annie's name twice, sounding completely lost in the moment. Annie stood there frozen, wondering if she was dreaming or if her boss was actually this bold. She felt a weird mix of sharp pain in her heart and overwhelming joy at the same time. She tried to tell herself that Miss Key was only doing this because she was intoxicated. Internally, she was trying to keep it professional, but her feelings were winning the battle. Miss Key gripped Annie's shirt tightly as if she was afraid Annie would disappear if she let go. Annie realized she didn't want to pull away and actually wanted to be even closer to her. She acknowledged that her boss was just drunk, but she still felt a desperate need to hold her tight. Her mind raced with thoughts about how soft Miss Key felt and how her skin felt like it was burning through her clothes. She wished she could just make time stand still so this moment would never have to end. A single tear escaped her eye as she struggled with the intensity of her own emotions. The urge to lean in for a kiss was almost impossible to ignore, but Annie knew the reality of the situation. She told herself that she couldn't cross that line because she knew it wasn't the right time. Annie stood there completely frozen as her brain went into full-blown manual override. She tried to convince herself that she just liked Miss Key in a totally normal, platonic way. She told herself she just wanted to be friends because Miss Key was the definition of elegant and graceful. Internally, she was basically writing a fanfic about how Miss Key was as pure and clean as a lily. She kept repeating the mantra that being friends was a beautiful thing. They could hold each other and joke around like normal people. But then her logic hit a massive brick wall because she realized friends don't usually spend their time thinking about kissing. The intrusive thoughts started winning as Annie began imagining things that were definitely not in the friendship contract. She pictured herself kissing Miss Key's brows and then moving down to her cheeks. Finally, she imagined what it would be like to actually put her lips on hers. She didn't just want a hug, she wanted more. In fact, she wanted way more than she was willing to admit. Internally, she was screaming at herself to get a grip before she did something she couldn't take back. Back in reality, the two of them were still locked in an embrace against a brick wall. Annie finally had to face the music and admit that her feelings had officially vaulted over the friendship fence. The weight of the realization was so heavy that she actually started tearing up. Miss Key felt the shift and pulled back slightly to look at her. She asked Annie what was wrong, looking genuinely concerned. Annie immediately tried to deflect and claim she was totally fine. Internally, she was panicking at a level 10. She kept telling herself that she absolutely could not let Miss Key know she was a total emotional wreck. Miss Key wasn't falling for the act and reached out to touch Annie's face. Her fingers brushed against Annie's skin and she realized the girl was actually crying. Miss Key whispered her name, clearly waiting for an explanation that wasn't coming. Annie stayed silent, her hair shadowing her eyes as she tried to hide her face. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife, and Annie felt like her heart was about to jump out of her chest. Suddenly, Miss Key leaned in and planted a soft kiss right on Annie's forehead. Annie was totally blindsided by the gesture. She couldn't understand why Miss Key was being so gentle or why they were being this intimate in the middle of the street. It felt like Miss Key was taking the whole situation way too lightly while Annie was having a literal existential crisis. Internally, she felt like her peace of mind had been completely hijacked. She looked up at Miss Key with watery eyes, feeling like she was being played. Annie finally found her voice and told Miss Key straight to her face that she was being incredibly sly. She felt like she was the only one struggling while Miss Key just glided through life being perfect. The two of them stood a few feet apart as the gravity of the moment finally started to sink in. Small yellow lights flickered around them like they were in some kind of dream, but the vibe was anything but peaceful. Annie stared at the woman in front of her, feeling completely lost. She looked down and asked herself what she was even doing with her life at this point. She was broke, stressed, and now hopelessly falling for her boss, who seemed to be playing 4D chess with her heart. Annie stood in front of her mirror, pulling on a striped off-the-shoulder top and a black choker while her brain went into full-on damage control. Internally, she was chanting a mantra of pure denial, telling herself over and over that whatever she was feeling was absolutely not love. She stared at her reflection, her face blank, and her blue eyes filled with a total lack of confidence. She tried to force a smile, but it looked more like a grimace from someone about to undergo surgery without anesthesia. She quickly looked away, the weight of her feelings crashing down as she whispered to herself that this could not be love. She squeezed her eyes shut, desperately trying to reset her facial expressions because she knew she had to keep up appearances at all costs. Internally, she was spiraling, realizing she couldn't stand the idea of Miss Key hating her or looking at her with disgust. She decided that as long as they kept the friends label, she was safe and Miss Key would never leave her. It was a foolproof plan, provided she could ignore the fact that her heart was currently doing backflips in a dumpster fire. Later, she headed over to the combined coffee shop and bookstore where the atmosphere was thick with unspoken tension. Miss Key was already there, looking effortlessly cool in a red blazer and holding a cup of coffee like she owned the world. She called out Annie's name the second she spotted her, clearly waiting to see if the college girl was still a total mess after their last encounter. Annie tried to play it cool, giving a quick morning greeting while her internal alarm bells were ringing at maximum volume. Miss Key gave her a sharp, expectant look, basically asking for an explanation for her behavior without saying a word. Annie realized she had to pull off the performance of a lifetime and forced her brightest, most innocent smile. Internally, she was sweating buckets, repeating to herself that the smile was her only shield against getting totally blindsided by her own emotion. Miss Key seemed satisfied with the act, her expression softening into a pleasant, controlled smile that masked whatever she was really thinking. She wished Annie a good morning, acting like everything was perfectly normal, and they hadn't just crossed a major emotional line. Annie didn't stick around for a chat and immediately announced she had to go, making a break for it before her composure crumbled. As she walked away, she kept that fake smile plastered on her face, convinced that her little charade had worked. She told herself that nothing would change and they were still just friends, even though she was clearly the most delusional person in the building. Annie sat slumped at her desk, letting out a heavy, dramatic sigh as she tried to navigate her current emotional train wreck. She stared blankly at the photos on the wall, desperately repeating a mantra in her head to stay calm and not let her guard down for even a second. Internally, she was screaming, "Don't let her see. You sweat. You're a professional at denial now, so keep it together." She checked her surroundings like an illegal resident dodging a landlord, making sure her face didn't betray the absolute chaos brewing inside her mind. Every nerve was on edge as she tried to maintain her just friends facade while her heart was doing frantic backflips. Suddenly, Miss Coy appeared out of nowhere like a ghost in a condemned building, carrying a tray with a single cup of tea. Before Annie could even hear a footstep, she felt a firm but light pat on her shoulder that sent a jolt through her spine. Miss Key called out her name in that calm, observant voice that always seemed to cut right through Annie's nonsense and see the truth. Annie nearly jumped out of her skin, her eyes going wide with a look of pure terror, as she spun around to face the silver-haired woman. It was a total jump scare, and her composure was officially shattered within seconds of the encounter starting. Annie immediately went into full defensive mode, accusing Miss Key of literally floating because she hadn't made a single sound while walking across the floor. She squeezed her eyes shut and shouted that they weren't nearly close enough for that kind of physical contact, clearly overcompensating for how rattled she felt by the touch. In her head, she was panicking. Boundary check, lady. My heart is already a mess. I can't handle the physical affection too. She looked like a cornered cat, her face scrunched up in a mix of embarrassment and genuine irritation. Miss Key just stood there with a neutral expression, watching the younger girl's spectacular meltdown with practiced, annoying patience. With a faint, mysterious smile that felt way too suspicious for a simple beverage delivery, Miss Key offered her a cup of flower tea. She told Annie to give it a try, acting like it was a perfectly normal gesture of kindness from a boss to an employee. She didn't stick around for the review or a thank you, simply turning on her heel and walking away as if she had more important business to attend to. Annie sat there staring at the steaming cup, feeling a bit silly for her earlier freakout over a simple pat on the back. She decided to take a sip to calm her fried nerves, thinking maybe some herbal vibes were exactly what she needed to survive the rest of the day without another mental breakdown. The second the liquid hit her tongue, Annie completely froze as if she'd just been hit with a high-voltage stun gun. It wasn't relaxing or floral at all. In fact, the tea was so incredibly bitter it felt like she was drinking liquid charcoal mixed with pure regret. A literal poof of white smoke seemed to erupt from her mouth as her face contorted into a mask of pure betrayal and disgust. Internally, she was fuming. Is this tea or a literal death flag in a cup? She's definitely trying to poison the evidence of my feelings. She clutched the desk, her eyes watering from the overwhelming bitterness that was currently destroying her taste buds. Annie turned around and shouted Miss Key's name with every ounce of frustration she had left, realizing she'd been totally blindsided by a petty prank. Miss Key didn't even try to maintain her usual cool exterior, letting out a genuine, audible laugh that echoed through the room. Annie stared at her with a WTF expression, her face turning red with anger as she realized she'd been played like a cheap fiddle. She screamed that the bookstore owner had definitely served the bitter tea on purpose, just to see her react like a cartoon character. However, as Miss Key looked back at her, the teasing smile softened into something more meaningful and quiet. She thought to herself that she was actually glad because for the first time in a while Annie hadn't forced a fake laugh to hide her pain. She preferred the messy, genuine anger over the plastic mask Annie had been using to protect herself from reality. Annie decided to double down on her just friend strategy because her brain could not handle anything more complicated. Over time, she and Miss Key settled into a routine that looked almost convincingly normal. Internally, Annie was constantly checking her own pulse, but she kept the facade up as they drifted into a comfortable rhythm. They started doing the typical bestie activities, like hitting the shops and grabbing dinner while gossiping about the latest makeup trends. They even reached the goodnight text phase of their relationship, which felt suspiciously like a trap to Annie's overthinking mind. Internally, she scoffed at her own phone. If they were just friends, she wondered why. She was staring at the screen for 20 minutes before hitting send. Miss Key played her role to perfection, occasionally hitting Annie with a look that was far too gentle for comfort. She started holding Annie's hand whenever they were in a crowded area, which Annie told herself was just a safety precaution. Miss Key even went as far as memorizing Annie's favorite foods, making Annie feel totally seen and totally terrified at the same time. Despite the internal sirens going off, Annie convinced herself she was happy as long as they maintained the status quo. She did not want to rock the boat and end up sinking in the middle of an emotional ocean she wasn't ready to swim in. One day at the shop, a coworker popped in with a couple of movie tickets she could not use. Her boyfriend had to work late, so she suggested Miss Key take Annie out for a night at the cinema instead. Miss Key turned to Annie with a neutral expression and asked if she was free to tag along for the show. Annie gave a quick nod, thinking a movie was a safe, low-stakes activity for two ordinary friends to enjoy. Miss Key took the tickets and thanked the girl while Annie tried to act like her heart was not doing backflips in her chest. Annie finally got a good look at the ticket and realized the movie was titled Midnight Screams. Internally, she felt a cold sweat coming on as she realized what was happening. A thriller was literally the oldest trick in the book for manufactured physical proximity. The theater announcement blared that the show was starting in 5 minutes and warned everyone to be on time. Miss Key turned to her and casually suggested they get a move on before they missed the opening credits. Annie stood there like a deer in headlights, asking if they were seriously about to watch a thriller of all things. Miss Key just gave a small, mischievous laugh and confirmed the plan, without a hint of mercy in her eyes. Before Annie could even process the massive death flag, Miss Key reached out and firmly interlaced their fingers. She started dragging a shell-shocked Annie toward the theater entrance with a cheerful command to let's go. Annie followed along with a 1,000-yard stare, feeling her internal batteries hit zero instantly. She looked completely drained and empty as they walked into the dark room together. Internally, she was screaming that Miss Key was absolutely crazy for setting up such a classic romantic cliché. She knew she was in for a long night of jump scares and very intentional hand-holding. One day, Annie and Miss Key were sitting in a crowded movie theater while a romance played out on the big screen. Miss Key glanced over at her companion and noticed something was definitely off. Internally, she wondered if the movie was too intense, or if Annie was just overthinking their just friends status again. She called out Annie's name softly, but Annie didn't even flinch. Annie was staring straight ahead with a completely blank expression, looking like she had just seen a ghost. Internally, Annie was actually screaming in silence because she couldn't handle the tension of being on a fake date. Miss Key decided she had seen enough of Annie's catatonic state and reached over to grab her hand firmly. The sudden touch made Annie snap out of it immediately, her eyes widening in total surprise. Annie looked at Miss Key with a dazed expression, finally realizing she wasn't just dreaming. Miss Key tightened her grip on Annie's fingers, signaling that she wasn't letting go anytime soon. Without another word, Miss Key stood up and told Annie they were leaving the theater right that second. Annie was pulled out of her seat, following along like a bewildered sidekick. They moved through the theater rows with Miss Key leading the way, and Annie trailing behind in a daze. Annie kept calling out Miss Key's name, but the bookstore owner was on a mission and wouldn't stop. They walked through the exit and toward the bright lights of the mall, their hands still firmly interlocked. Miss Key walked with a determined stride that screamed main character energy. Internally, Annie felt like an illegal resident in her own skin, totally unsure of how to react to the physical contact. She looked down at their joined hands and felt a strange, terrifying sense of comfort. Internally, she finally admitted that the hand-holding was actually pretty nice. The scene transitioned as they arrived at a trendy shop called XXT. They stood outside the glass doors, the silence between them becoming almost deafening in the public space. Miss Key turned to Annie and asked why she hadn't said a single word if the movie was really that scary. Annie looked down at the floor, unable to meet her gaze, feeling like her brain had been fried by the plot twist. She finally managed to mutter a quiet thank you, which seemed to change the mood instantly. Miss Key stared at her for a long moment, her usual sharp expression melting into something much softer. Miss Key took a step toward her, closing the gap until Annie was practically cornered near the door. She reached up and placed her hand on Annie's head, a classic power move that left Annie totally blindsided. Annie could only gasp out Miss Key's name, her heart probably doing backflips in her chest. Internally, she realized she was caught in a romantic cliché with absolutely no escape route. Miss Key looked her dead in the eye, her expression serious and expectant as she leaned in. She finally asked the one question Annie had been dreading and hoping for at the same time. Miss Key asked if Annie actually liked her, and the denial era was officially hitting a brick wall. Miss Key dropped the ultimate bombshell and asked Annie point blank if she liked her. Annie stared back with her eyes wide, totally blindsided by the directness of the question. Her brain practically short-circuited as the words echoed in the silence of the tea shop. Internally, she was screaming because she was not prepared for this level of confrontation. She looked down at the floor, desperately trying to figure out what kind of like Miss Key was even talking about. Was she looking for a confession of friendship, or was she digging for something way more scandalous? Annie felt like she was walking through a minefield where one wrong word would trigger a total social explosion. Miss Key just stood there, looking as cool and composed as ever while Annie struggled to keep her soul from leaving her body. Annie realized she couldn't stay silent forever or things would get even weirder. She forced herself to look up and meet that intense, golden gaze. She decided her only move was to play it safe and plastered a high-energy, fake smile on her face. She chirped that of course she liked her because they were friends. She even tried to flip the script by calling the question hypocritical and calling Miss Key weird for even bringing it up. Internally, she was absolutely dying because the truth was that she liked every single thing about the woman. To Annie, Miss Key was her favorite person in the entire world. But she wasn't about to hand her heart on a silver platter. She told herself she had to keep smiling or the whole facade would crumble into a million pieces. She thought, if I just keep acting like this is a joke, maybe I can survive the night. Miss Key didn't look impressed or relieved by the just friends excuse at all. She stared at Annie with those unreadable eyes for a long, heavy moment. The silence stretched out until it felt like the air was getting thin. Finally, Miss Key gave a short, clipped response and just said okay. Her voice sounded like a closing door, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. The vibe shifted instantly from high-stakes, romantic tension to an absolute frostbite zone. Miss Key turned her back and decided the conversation was officially over. She stated it was time to head home since it was getting late and she clearly wasn't interested in hearing any more lies. Annie watched her walk away and felt a sudden, sharp chill settle into her bones. Her hands started trembling like crazy as the reality of the situation finally hit her. She watched Miss Key's retreating figure and felt like a total failure. She started spiraling, wondering if Miss Key had already seen through her pathetic lie and was just disgusted. She panicked, thinking that maybe Miss Key was actually sick of her and wanted to keep her distance from now on. She beat herself up for not being a better liar and wondered why she had to catch feelings in the first place. Internally, she scoffed at her own bad luck and wondered how she could be so transparent. She realized that she was totally doomed because she couldn't hide her heart even if her life depended on it. She sighed, thinking that if they actually were just friends, her life wouldn't be such a massive, confusing disaster. She looked at the empty space where Miss Key had been standing and wished that everything could just go back to being simple. One thing was for sure, the just friends defense was definitely falling apart. Days passed by and the atmosphere between Annie and Miss Key turned straight up radioactive. Annie found herself lingering outside the bookstore, but the vibe was totally off. Miss Key's indifference was becoming more and more obvious, and she looked like she was actively trying to phase Annie out of her life. Internally, Annie was screaming because her just friends lie had clearly backfired into a total friendship funeral. Desperate to fix things, Annie called Miss Key to ask if she wanted to see a new movie the day after tomorrow. She was basically throwing a Hail Mary at this point. Miss Key wasn't having it and shut her down immediately. She told Annie she wasn't free and had zero time to spare, which is basically high-end code for don't call me again. Annie played it cool on the phone, saying it didn't matter, but her heart was basically doing a faceplant. Back at home, she was a total wreck and could do nothing but cry. Internally, she realized that being just friends was way harder when the other person actually took the hint and moved on. Slowly, she lost the desire to even visit the bookstore anymore. She didn't want to be anywhere near the person who was ghosting her in plain sight. Eventually, the two of them completely lost touch, and the silence was deafening. It was like they were back to being strangers, which is the ultimate death flag for any relationship. Sometime later, Annie was out on the school field, trying to live her life while holding some equipment. She was busy talking to a random guy, looking like she might have finally moved on from the drama. Little did she know Miss Key was actually standing nearby, watching her from the sidelines like a low-key stalker. Miss Key watched as Annie chatted and laughed, looking completely unaffected by their months of silence. Internally, Miss Key felt a pang of regret, thinking that, even after all this time, everything for Annie seemed to be exactly the same. She reached out and touched a leaf, finally deciding to break the ice she had built herself. She stepped out and approached Annie, who was totally blindsided by the sudden appearance. Annie's eyes went wide as she realized her former crush was standing right there. Miss Key gave her a small, almost hesitant smile. Annie gripped her skirt so hard her knuckles probably turned white, trying to keep herself together. She managed to stammer out that it had been a long, long time. Miss Key looked her right in the eye, finally dropping the Ice Queen act for a second. She echoed the sentiment, telling Annie it had indeed been a long time. Internally, Annie was probably wondering if this was a peace treaty or just another round of emotional gymnastics. Miss Key finally broke the silence that had been stretching on for months with a simple long time no see. Annie looked totally blindsided, standing there, like she had just seen a ghost from her past. They stood near a lonely park bench, the vibe becoming incredibly awkward in record time. Annie finally found her voice and asked what the bookstore owner was even doing at her school. Miss Key played it cool, explaining that a professor had been looking for her but had just left. Internally, Annie was probably wondering if that was just a convenient excuse to show up. The two of them stood in a heavy silence, neither knowing how to bridge the gap that months of ghosting had created. Annie looked down at her feet, feeling the weight of everything unsaid. Suddenly, someone off-screen shouted for Annie to come back because it was time for her group to gather. Annie took the exit strategy, clutching her skirt so tight her knuckles were probably turning white. She managed to mutter a weak "see you" and a quick bye before turning to walk away. Internally, she was already spiraling, convinced that this was the absolute end of their story. She told herself they would likely never see each other again, and prepared to bury her feelings for good. Miss Key watched her walk away, telling herself there would be no more tears. But just as the distance between them grew, she called out Annie's name one more time. Annie froze in her tracks, her heart probably doing gymnastics in her chest. She told herself to stop hoping and wondered if she was just having a massive hallucination. She was convinced her mind was playing tricks on her, but she stopped moving anyway. Then Miss Key dropped the real shocker by asking Annie to come by the bookstore later if she was free. Annie gasped, the realization hitting her like a freight train that this wasn't an illusion at all. The waterworks started immediately as she turned, around her face a mess of relief and shock. She wiped at her eyes, trying to process that the door she thought was locked forever had just been kicked open. She nodded vigorously and blurted out a desperate sure and yes. Her hands were still trembling like crazy as she said her final "see you later" to Miss Key. Annie turned and walked away for real this time, but with a completely different energy. Miss Key stayed behind, watching her go with a soft expression that suggested things might finally be heading in the right direction. Annie arrived at the entrance of the coffee bookstore, looking at the glass doors like they were the gates to a final boss room. She reached out and gripped the handle, her hand shaking as her anxiety started to read line. After a second of pure hesitation, she loosened her hold, trying to talk herself out of pulling a disappearing act. She took a massive, shaky inhale to steady her nerves and fill her lungs with some much-needed courage. Finally, she committed to the bit and shoved both doors open at once. The shop was quiet and peaceful, with the display case full of cupcakes looking way more appetizing than Annie felt. She spotted Miss Key sitting alone at a booth by the window, looking perfectly composed while reading a book. Annie walked over and managed to drop a formal good afternoon, feeling like a total dork. Miss Key didn't miss a beat, looking up from her page and returning the greeting with a soft smile. Annie just stood there in total silence, her brain basically displaying a loading icon as she stared. Miss Key didn't wait for her to reboot and told her to come over because she had something important to say. Internally, Annie was already imagining 10 different ways this could go south. She stepped closer to the table, her guard still partially up as she waited for the news. Suddenly, Miss Key's hand shot out and executed a high-speed grasp on Annie's forearm. Annie's eyes practically bugged out of her head in total shock at the sudden physical contact. Before she could even say anything about personal space, Miss Key yanked her downward with surprising strength. Annie was dragged right into the booth, her balance completely failing her as she landed. Miss Key told her to sit tight, acting like she hadn't just kidnapped her into a seat. They were sitting shoulder to shoulder now, and the proximity was hitting the danger zone. Miss Key turned her head to look directly at her, her golden eyes locking onto Annie's panicked ones. Annie's face immediately exploded into a bright red disaster zone as she looked away. Internally, she was having a massive meltdown, wondering why she's having such a huge case of déjà vu. She questioned who Miss Key thought she was pulling these kinds of smooth moves out of nowhere. It definitely wasn't the first time Miss Key had been this bold with her, and Annie was reaching her absolute limit. Miss Key leaned in even closer, making sure she had Annie's full, terrified attention. She whispered Annie's name, her voice dropping to a level that made Annie's heart do a backflip. Then she dropped the ultimate bombshell on the poor girl. Miss Key casually asked if Annie could come over to her place later that night. Annie was totally blindsided, her internal monologue screaming that this was definitely not part of the plan. She sat there in stunned silence, wondering if she had accidentally walked into a romance novel instead of a bookstore. Miss Key just kept smiling, looking way too satisfied with the chaos she was causing. Annie felt like she was trapped in a whirlwind, her mind racing through every possible red flag. This was supposed to be a simple talk, but now she was getting invited to a private residence. Internally, she scoffed at her own luck, thinking that she really should have seen this coming. She was now officially in over her head, and there was no easy way to back out. Miss Key's eyes were practically glowing with mischief as she waited for an answer. Annie knew her life was about to get a lot more complicated very quickly. She just hoped she could survive the night without her heart actually stopping. Miss Key picked up a shiny red apple and offered it to Annie like she was a snack-obsessed fairy godmother. Annie immediately went into panic mode and waved it off, insisting she didn't want it. Internally, she was screaming. Seriously, does she think I'm Snow White or something? Miss Key didn't take the hint and stared her down with those intense yellow eyes, asking if there was anything else she wanted to eat. She even promised to get whatever Annie liked, which felt like a total setup. Annie played it cool and said she didn't need anything, but her face was already turning a lovely shade of beet red. She couldn't help but wonder what Miss Key's angle was. Internally, she was spiraling. Why is she doing this? Is she just that nice, or am I being punked? As they walked through the store, Annie couldn't stop staring at Miss Key, trying to decode her mysterious vibes. Miss Key eventually caught her and asked if there was something on her face. Annie felt like a total creep for getting caught. She was convinced that everything going wrong lately was clearly her fault, so this sudden princess treatment felt completely unearned. Internally, she sighed. Great, now I'm the weirdo staring at my boss in the produce aisle. Annie tried to pivot the conversation to food and asked if they were making seafood for dinner. Miss Key suggested seafood soup and asked if Annie was up for the task. Annie didn't even hesitate before shutting that down with a hard no. Miss Key tried to lower the bar and suggested maybe just some simple dishes instead. Annie doubled down on the nope and admitted she was basically a hazard in the kitchen. Internally, she winced. I can barely boil water without a manual, so let's not burn the house down on day one. Despite her lack of domestic skills, Annie started to feel a spark of hope. She wondered if it was possible that Miss Key actually liked her. Internally, she was doing mental gymnastics. Maybe she's already caught feelings. Why else would she be acting like personal chauffeur and chef? Miss Key just looked at her and claimed she could tell what Annie was thinking, which was a terrifying thought. They eventually made it back to the coffee bookstore, and Miss Key told Annie to wait while she went inside to let the staff know she was back. Suddenly, Miss Key froze in her tracks, like her internal server just crashed. Annie followed her gaze and saw a girl with blue hair standing right there, looking like she stepped out of a different manga entirely. The atmosphere shifted from cozy to awkward in record time. Annie was totally blindsided by the newcomer's presence. Internally, she felt a massive death flag waving in the wind. Who is this girl, and why does she look like she's about to ruin my entire week? The blue-haired girl smirked and dropped a casual long time no see like she owned the place. Miss Key just stood there and agreed, her usual playful energy completely gone. Annie felt a sharp, physical pain in her chest that definitely wasn't just indigestion. It was the realization that this new girl clearly had a deep history with Miss Key. Internally, she felt like a total clown for getting her hopes up. The confidence she had 5 minutes ago vanished instantly. She watched the two of them and realized that